I think an important part of my political development really started before I was even aware that I would ever be in politics, and that is what I call the Immigrant Experience. I came to the United States as a child with my mother and my brother from Switzerland, and we left because of the threat of Hitler overtaking Switzerland. We didn't know at that time that Switzerland would be able to stay neutral. So I came to America, full of idealism, with the American dream being very bright and very much alive. My mother instilled in both me and my brother the belief that anything is possible in America. I mean, it's a refrain that so many immigrant children hear, and we took it seriously. And I think that my mother gave us a sense of optimism, and it sounds like a cliche today, but it is still more true in America than any other country in the world. But the fact that this was the land of opportunity, this is where you could reinvent yourself, and that was a strong thread through my childhood and growing up period. And I think it gave me the sense of optimism that is necessary to get involved in politics. I mean, if you don't think the system can ever work or ever respond to your needs and concerns, you're not going to get involved. And I think I was able to sort of drum up that sense that I could do something. And I also believe I had a sense of responsibility that I must do something. And to that extent, the Holocaust, while it did not affect my immediate family, we lost aunts and an uncle and cousins who lived in Germany and France and Holland. The connection with the Holocaust gave me a sense that I could not be silent, and that I also lived in a time and place, both as a woman and as a Jewish woman, where I could speak out, where it was safe to do so, whereas for previous generations of my family, it had not been. To sort of get yourself off the couch, you have to have two almost conflicting motivations. One is a level of anger, that things are not right, that things should change, that you're not satisfied with the status quo. But anger alone is not enough. If you're too angry, you either opt out of the system or you become a radical revolutionary and want to tear the whole thing down. But the right measurement of anger leads to action if it is combined with optimism. And I think just, by serendipity, by chance, those two forces were part of my life, that I felt the need to speak out, and I felt the ability to speak out because I felt something would respond if I did. These two threads were woven into my life, a level of anger at injustice when I saw it, and a level of optimism that if I spoke out, if I took the chance, a positive reaction was possible, that something would happen. And I think that's what's most necessary today for young people and young women especially. And it's worth it. That's a theme in the book, that it's worth taking the chance. It's worth making the sacrifice, because you can, in fact, affect change. It wasn't a totally conscious feeling. It was only years later that I kind of analyzed, how did I get there? Why did I do what I did? At the time, there were two political movements. This was in the early 70s when I first ran for the legislature. There was the environmental movement and the women's movement. And both these movements affected me deeply. The environmental movement gave me an issue. This was the beginning of the first Earth Day. Vermont was a forerunner in environmental legislation and trying to control development. And I wanted to be in on that. I wanted to be on the side of those who supported protecting Vermont's environment and also beginning to think about a global environment through Earth Day. The book for my generation was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And I remember being very moved by that and feeling we've got to do something. And the other movement was the women's movement, which in the early 70s really affected my timing, I would say, more than anything else. I always thought I'd get involved in politics when my children were grown and off in college, and it was something in the far distant future. But the women's movement gave those of us in my generation permission to step out now, to become active. And I had 4 children. I was a very busy mother, but somehow the women's movement gave me the impetus to say, why not now? And running for the legislature in Vermont, which has a part-time citizen legislature, also gave me the chance to blend things, to juggle, the famous word that all women use, because I could integrate still being a mother and wife and being in the legislature, which met 4 days a week, at that time 4 months a year, and that was my first foray into politics. Timing is everything in politics. So I spent 6 years in the legislature, 3 two-year terms, and then I was lieutenant governor for 2 more terms. And lieutenant governor in Vermont is not a full-time job, though I did give it pretty much full-time attention. But all that time, my children were growing up. So by the time I ran for governor, my children were in college, and my youngest son was in high school. So my children grew up as I grew up, and I became more and more involved. And it followed a pattern that I could deal with. One of the questions women have, of course, and men have them too, though women feel somewhat more of a family responsibility, is, what will this do to my family? What will this do to my privacy? And it's a question I asked, of course, and more than once. There were conflicts, there were some tough times, but I was able to continue and to do it and to feel that the rewards were great. The rewards in terms of a sense of accomplishment, of doing things for other people. The key is to prepare yourself for the future and not to close doors. I mean, women's lives are long. When you have 4 little kids running around with runny noses, and you say, I'll never get out of the house, I'll never do anything with my life, I'm going to be here forever, much as I love them, I do want something more out of life. And then lo and behold, a few years later, they're all in school, and you do have that opportunity. So I think it's almost a mindset that you can imagine yourself doing different things in the future, things that are very different from when you're a full-time mother. One of the instant gratifications of winning an election is that one is given a bully pulpit. And I think one of the most exciting things of holding public office is that you have a voice, and you have a voice that is listened to. You have a title which literally entitles you to have a voice. So as governor, probably the most gratifying part of the job was being able to set an agenda. Of course, you don't get the whole agenda. You work with the legislature, you work with constituencies, you work with all the people in the state who have an opinion about everything, but you lay down the first marker, and you can that way have an impact. Of course, the road gets rough, there are disappointments, there are fights, there are criticisms, But if you keep your eye on the long-term vision, it's possible to have an impact. So I think one thing that I look back on, and my glasses are probably getting more rosy over time, it is that being able to express your inner values, your inner priorities, and see them reflected in a public agenda. Now, it doesn't happen every day. As I indicated, there's some battles you lose, but the ones you win, you can say, yes, this happened because of our ability to bring about, in a democratic process, some kind of change. It can be as small as changing, well, it's not so small. It can be, giving opportunities to women on welfare. We started a program called Reach Up, which enabled women to get educated, get child care, and get off of welfare. This was before the Clinton welfare reform. We were able to establish a program called Dr. Dinosaur that provided health care coverage for children. I think it was the first in the country to do so. Some environmental laws, some job-creating laws. So it may not last forever. You don't know how you'll go down in history, but that's not the point. The point is that you're using your energy, your whatever God-given abilities you have to the utmost of your ability. And you're in kind of the swirl of life. I think, even now when I go to political events, I'm reminded how exciting it is, because each of us in our private lives can kind of, put blinkers on. We can go down pathways that are very safe, where we always mix with the same people who agree with us. But in political life, you suddenly, you got a smorgasbord out there of ideas and people and backgrounds. And I guess I enjoy that. I enjoy the people as well as the ideas. And that's one of the things that's a prerequisite. You've got to like dealing with people, and people who may be very different from you, but you have to have enough empathy and understanding about their lives in order to be able to help them. Politics does not have to be a lifetime career. That is elective politics. We've gotten into the habit now of people running for office forever. And when somebody decides to retire at the age of 79, it's a news story after having served a lifetime in public office. I ran for 3 terms. Vermont has 2-year terms. So I was in elective office a total of 16 years. And when I didn't run for a 4th term, people asked, why? They assumed that was almost a failure not to run for re-election. Well, I don't consider it a failure. I wanted to really move on to see what would happen next. And again, timing was important. Bill Clinton was elected president. I worked on the campaign. I was part of the transition. I was on a 3-person group to advise him on the vice president. And then I ended up as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, and later as ambassador to Switzerland. And I didn't plan it this way, but it turned out that each position prepared me for the next position, because what I learned as governor was very useful in the United States Department of Education, because people in Washington sometimes totally forget or never knew in the first place how programs work at the state and local level. And as ambassador, my ability to reach out to people, my enjoyment of public events was a key part of being a good ambassador, really showing your interest in the country. And so each step prepared me for the next and was, in a way, a new adventure. My position in Switzerland as the American ambassador sort of made my life come full circle. And my mother, who was widowed at an early age when I was under 3 years of age, never dreamt, even though she said anything is possible in America, not in her wildest dreams would she imagine that her daughter would someday come back as the American ambassador. So that was a nice story, if you may. And then it just so happened that while I was there, the major issue was the Jewish bank accounts. Jews had deposited money in numbered Swiss bank accounts for safekeeping. After the war, they tried to retrieve those funds, or their heirs of those who were murdered, and the bank stonewalled. And the whole story of Switzerland's role during the war began to unravel. So I was in a very interesting position to try to bring this chapter of history to a positive conclusion. And it was a very emotional experience, but it was also a very positive experience, which I talk about in the book. I think if I would have been born in the suffrage movement, I would have really enjoyed myself. I know something drew me to the whole question of how women can lead complete and effective lives. And maybe because my mother was a widow and I saw that her life was hard. In the 70s, all kinds of things were happening. Women's groups were being formed. And the point of the Women's Political Caucus was to encourage women to run for office. And at one of our meetings, another woman and I looked at each other and we said to each other, "Why don't you run?" "Yeah, why don't you run?" So we were inspired, as I said, by this movement. And I've been giving speeches for years and years. I taught a seminar, both at two colleges and here at the University of Vermont, on women, politics, and leadership. So it seemed the right time to try to put it together. And in a very basic sense, I really want to pass the torch to the next generation. Women of my generation were in the vanguard, but I always thought there'd be a tidal wave following us. Once we opened the door a crack, it would just blast open and all these women would come rushing through the doors to political office. Well, that hasn't happened. One of the surprising statistics that I mention in the book is the figure 16%. That is the percentage of women in the United States Congress today in 2008. 16% also happens to be, at this point in time, the percentage of women in top corporate leadership positions. And 16% has a third meaning, and that is the percentage of women in parliaments around the world. The United States, incidentally, ranks 69th out of 187 countries in the percentage of women we have in the lower house of parliament. That's an amazing figure to me, because here we are, democracy, we pride ourselves on equal opportunity, and yet we're way down there compared to other countries. And that's the question I try to explore. Why? What is holding women back? When women are educated as never before, there are more women than men in college today, more women than men in graduate schools. So we can't use that excuse. We know what's going on, we are informed, but something is barring the door. And that's my question, and I try to come up with some answers. I don't believe that having more women elected is going to be the answer to everything. Obviously, women are liberal, conservative, Republican, Democratic, third parties, but there's still some differences overall between how women vote once they get into office and how men vote, and even how women vote in elections. So that slight difference, which comes from nothing more complicated than different life experiences, that slight difference can make a difference in the final count, because most of the issues of our time are, as we know only too well, are sharply divided. So, the vote in the Senate might be 52 to 48 on an issue like paid family leave, or an issue like automobile emission standards. So they're close votes because the country is closely divided. So having more women can be the tipping point on some of these issues, which brings it over the edge to the other side. And we need those. It's not only can they make a difference, we need talent in our political system. And if we're drawing on only half the population for that talent, we're missing a great deal as a country. So I'm not writing this book only from a feminist point of view. I'm writing it from a point of view of we have to change this country. And women and other outsiders, people of color, should be there in proportion to the population in the country. That's what democracy should be about, and that's what we can bring about. As I went about writing this book, I quickly concluded that it was not enough for me to tell my story. My story is interwoven through the book, but it's really the voices of other women who are in political life today that I think can provide the most powerful role models for women of this generation and younger. I talk to women who have tremendous courage, who ran for office against all the odds, African American women who were not expected to win, who held on to their faith that they could change the system. One woman told me, some people get the dream sucked out of them. I'm not going to let that happen to me. I talked to a woman in New Hampshire who was not expected to win at all, Carol Shea Porter, but she heard something. She heard what she called the rumbling underneath, that people were dissatisfied, and she wanted to be there to represent the bottom 99% of us. I talked to Hillary Clinton. What made her run for office in the first place? What is making her run for president? And I analyzed some of the forces at work in her campaign, both positive and negative. I tried to analyze what is the meaning of gender. We've elected women. Other countries have elected women presidents. I have a chapter on women presidents in other parts of the world. What is it about the United States that makes it still such a phenomenon to think of a female president? So that the question is asked, are we ready for a woman president? As if, like the ball dropping on New Year's Eve, suddenly the ball will drop and yes, we're ready for a president. Of course, it won't happen that way. Depends on the woman, depends on the time. But the fact that it's considered such a tremendous leap is almost bizarre for the United States. And, many races, that isn't the question. For legislative races, I think in state legislatures, and even in most cases for Congress, the gender issue has pretty much dissipated. People are used to seeing women there. But for an executive position like governor, and of course multiplied 100 times for president of the United States, the question is there. Because the vision in our heads is of male presidents. And the portraits we see on the walls, whether it is the White House or the State House or the boardroom of any corporation, those portraits are almost exclusively male. So when you say leadership, when you say president, you don't see the picture in your head of a woman, you see the picture of a man. And that is true for women as well as for men, because we have all been brought up in a society that equates leadership with male leadership. One of the differences I found that many women's organizations have discovered who encourage women to run for office is that women are less likely to identify themselves to run for political office. The jargon for it is self-identify. A young man will wake up while he's shaving, look in the mirror and say, maybe I think I can run for the United States Senate. Well, very few, if any, women do that. They want to be over-prepared, over-experienced before they throw their hats in the ring. So we have to figure out how to ask women. If they don't ask themselves, we have to ask them, and that is beginning to happen. But there are differences. There are things we can do, and it's about time that we do them.